All right, well, welcome to our book talk tonight. I'm glad you all can join us. I'm here with Alan Dettlaff, who is the author of Confronting the Racist Legacy of the American Child Welfare System. He is also a professor at the University of Houston's Graduate School of Social Work, the co-founder of the Upend movement, a collaborative effort to abolish the current child welfare system as we know it. And he is also the co-founder, editor of a peer review journal, Abolitionist Perspectives in Social Work, and has an upcoming book that he is also a co-editor of, Social Work, White Supremacy, and Racial Justice. So I welcome Alan to our talk tonight.
Thank you all. I appreciate the invitation to be with y'all. I'm excited to be here.
So in terms of today's discussion and format, the discussion will be in 4 parts. We'll give Alan an opportunity to give you an overview of the book if you haven't read it, so you can engage and understand today's conversation. We'll also examine his book within the context of knowledge production, ecosystemic theory, and then we'll discuss system transformation. So Alan, before we jump into the discussion on knowledge production, if you could just give an overview of the book and provide any key takeaways or lessons that you hope that readers would get.
Yeah, thanks, Desiree. I think that when I was thinking about writing this book, one of the main goals of it that I hope comes across is, and you could see this just from the image on the cover, is to connect the history of family separations in the United States from the origins of that practice during chattel slavery to the family separations that happen today through the child welfare system, or what I and many people call the family policing system. I think that connection is important because we don't talk about it often. People understand that there were children separated from their parents during chattel slavery. They may not realize the extent to which that happened, that it was up to 2/3 of enslaved children were taken away from their parents, sold away from their parents, sometimes just murdered because they were in the way. But we look at that as a historical artifact. And then we know that there are other times in our history where children have been forcibly separated from their parents. That happened to indigenous children who were placed in Indian boarding schools. That happened to children during the Japanese internment camps. And then, of course, recently that happened during the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy of about 5 years ago. And I think zero tolerance is a really good example of a time in our history, a very recent time in our history, where we saw family separations occur and there was national outrage about those separations. There were protests, there were groups of pediatricians and psychologists who called family separations tantamount to torture, so much to the extent that that policy ended. But when we look at zero tolerance, during the entire zero tolerance policy, we see that about 3,000 children were separated from their families during that time. The child welfare system in the United States removes over 3,000 children weekly from their parents, and that goes largely unnoticed. So I think when we think about family separations, the fault that we've had is that we look at these as isolated incidents rather than a continuum. Because when you really think about family separations, there has not been one instance in the history of the United States where the government has forcibly separated white children from their parents. So really what family separation is a tool used by the state to maintain the oppression of Black and brown people, originating in the days of chattel slavery that continues through today. It's looked different in these different eras, but it's the same practice used by the government. So connecting that history of family separations. And then I'd say the second thing that I really wanted to get across was this idea of intent, that this is not an accident. The oppression of Black families that happens today through the child welfare system is not something that is unknown to the child welfare system. It's something that has been deeply embedded into the policies and procedures of this system for decades. And I think the best example of that is mandatory reporting laws, which come from the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. Mandatory reporting laws is a really quick history, didn't exist before the 1960s. They began in around 1962 in response to an article called The Battered Child Syndrome, which was written by Dr. C. Henry Kemp and kind of set off a national child abuse panic. That led to mandatory reporting laws. In 1962, there were no mandatory reporting laws. By 1968, all 50 states had a mandatory reporting law. And what we saw immediately is that when mandatory reporting laws were implemented, in 1962, there were only about 600 cases of child abuse that were reported to the police. By 1968, when mandatory reporting laws were in effect, there were over 11,000 cases reported to these mandatory reporting hotlines. Nearly 50% of them, 45% of them, were on Black families, even though Black families were only about 8% of the population at that time. When the white legislators, ultimately got around to holding legislative hearings to federalize the system of mandatory reporting, there was a decade of information showing that if we institutionalize mandatory reporting at the federal level, if we also include this broad and vague category of neglect as part of maltreatment, that's going to severely and disproportionately harm Black children. But the government passed that law anyways. So people often talk about the unintended consequences of CAPTA, but when you know that a policy, if it is passed, is going to have a severe and disproportionate impact on Black families, and then you pass that policy anyways, and then that severe and disproportionate impact becomes a reality, that's not an unintended consequence. That's the clearly foreseeable outcome of that policy. So my book tries to demonstrate that there's been these moments throughout history where there was clear intent of the policies that have been put into place for today's purpose of the child welfare system to maintain the oppression of Black children.
As a follow-up to that, when you talk about CAPTA, can you speak to the fiscal implications also of CAPTA?
I'm not an expert on child welfare financing. From what I've understood from other people, particularly I would refer people to Richard Wexler, who's really an expert on child welfare financing and talks about this a lot on his blog, NCC, the National Coalition for Child Protection Reform, that the implication to the financing, well, one, in a big picture sense, I'm not concerned about the implications to the financing because I think mandatory reporting laws, CAPTA, should be repealed and that money should be redirected to families and communities. Usually when people talk about the implications to the financing, it's if we end mandatory reporting, then there's going to be less federal money that goes to the states. But that's still for the purpose of forcibly separating children from their families and keeping them in foster care. So I don't care about the financial implications. I don't want that money staying in the system.
And what has been the reactions to your book? You've been giving book talks, you've been on tour. What have some of the reactions been, both positive and maybe some adverse reactions?
The reaction has been very positive. I mean, the book has been reviewed well. Just the idea that I've been invited to different schools of social work, law schools, bookstores to talk about the book, I think shows that there's a lot of interest in this topic. And those book events have been well attended. People have had really good questions. So I think that in some ways shows how much interest there is in the topic. I often think, 5 years ago, no one in social work, I don't think anyone in law schools was really talking about the idea of abolition of the child welfare system. So the extent to which these conversations are getting out there, the idea that you would think that your audience with Foster America would be interested in hearing more about this, I think is testament to how much people want to learn about it. I think I haven't read or seen any negative critiques of the book. I know there are some. I know there are critics of the abolition movement that I address in the book. Those critiques largely focus on the idea of evidence, that
Mhm.
abolition isn't evidence based or evidence supported. And I just don't think that's the reality of the movement. I think my entire book is built on evidence. The evidence for abolition is everything we know about the harm that results from family separation, the horrifically poor outcomes that occur to children who experience family separation and placement in foster care, the high rates of physical and sexual abuse in foster care. We know that rates of abuse in foster care are 2 to 3 times higher than rates of physical and sexual abuse in the general public. So when people critique this work and say that if we abolish the child welfare system, children are going to be harmed, they're intentionally misunderstanding what this movement is all about. One, children right now are being harmed by what we're doing, by what our society is doing to children in when they come to the attention of the system. But two, they're also not talking about what abolition is really about, which is what Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, that abolition is presence, not absence. And when I think of that, I think about the presence of safety. And what keeps children safe is not a government system that forcibly takes children from their parents, puts them into strangers' home or institutions, and then subjects them to more abuse. That doesn't keep children safe. What keeps children safe is access to quality education, free and accessible health care, guaranteed income, child allowances, free and accessible substance use and mental health treatment for anyone who needs and wants that. Those are the things that keep children, keep families, communities safe. And that's what abolition is really about. But our critics don't talk about that part.
Right. Yeah. So just to follow up to that, in light of recent federal legislation that's being proposed where they are creating more lenient requirements for kinship placement. So, what's your thoughts and reactions to that the system is saying, okay, we're going to make it easier to place children with kin.
I'm absolutely supportive of the idea of children being with their family, with kin, whether that's kin, fictive kin, but having a place to go in times of crisis. I don't think that it should be the government who's making those decisions. I think that families and communities should have the power to make those decisions for themselves. This idea that the government is going to loosen restrictions on kin, we've seen that happen before. We've seen reform efforts where states have provided more money for kin, or they've made kin eligible to be licensed. Anytime that the state is involved, and whether it's placement in stranger foster care or whether it's placement with kin, all that does is subject families to this massive system of surveillance and punishment. And often placements with kin often become this system of surveillance and then compliance where kin family members have to participate in what the system will call voluntary services, but they're not voluntary. They're contingent on the child remaining in that home. And then any act of non-compliance results in that children being taken out of that kin placement and put into foster care. So it's a lot of smoke and mirrors is what I think about it. Reducing the requirements to have children placed as kin is just another reform in 60 years of reform efforts that have done nothing to address the underlying harm of family separation. Placing more children with kin does nothing to stop the family separations that the system keeps doing.
Thank you. I'll pause to see if anyone in the audience has any questions for Alan before we move on. What are the numbers for Latino families?
Rates of Latino children and families in the child welfare system vary a lot by state. When we talk about racial disproportionality or the overrepresentation of Black children in the system, that racial disproportionality conversation usually focuses on Black children because Black children are overrepresented at the national level at a rate of about twice the rate of white children involved in the system. Black children represent about 26 to 27% of children in foster care, even though they represent only about 12% of children in the general population. When we look nationally at Latino children, they're not overrepresented. They're about proportionally represented. Some states, Latino children and families are very overrepresented in the system. Some states they're not over. Some states they're very underrepresented. So the numbers vary a lot by state. And when we think about overrepresentation, it's really Black children and families who have been most severely impacted in the system since its earliest origins. California has one of the worst rates of overrepresentation in the country. In California, there's been research that shows that 1 out of every 8 Black children in the state will be forcibly separated from their parents by the time they turn 18. About 12% of all Black children in California will be placed into foster care. And Black children in California are taken from their parents at a rate 3 times that of white children. Whereas nationally, that number is about 2 times as likely. Black children are removed twice as likely as white children. So California has one of the worst rates of overrepresentation and disproportionality of Black children in the country. Oh, so there's a question about personal experience. Yeah, absolutely. I should have started with a little background about me. So I started my career working in the child welfare system. I actually got into social work because I wanted to work for Child Protective Services. When I was in my early 20s, I was kind of an aimless junior college student. I didn't know what I wanted to do as a career. I knew I wanted to do something that involved helping children and families, but I didn't know what that would look like or what kind of form that would take. And then one night I saw a news story where a reporter went on a ride along with a child protective services worker. And I thought, wow, that's the kind of work I want to do. I could really help children. And I changed my major to social work. I went to work for the system, and I worked for the system for 6 years where I did investigations, or what the system calls investigations. So I was responsible for investigating allegations of maltreatment and was also responsible for forcibly taking children from their parents. And when I was in the system, I really thought that I was helping children, because that's the culture of the agency. I really think of it now as a form of brainwashing, where parents are demonized and forcible separation is viewed as help. The harm of family separation, the overrepresentation of Black children and other children of color is never discussed in the agency. So it wasn't until I left the system that I started to understand, and I started to work on this issue of racial disproportionality in Texas, that I started to understand my complicity in causing harm to children and families. And that's what ultimately led me to get a PhD, because I wanted to study the impact that racism and racial bias had on decision-making in the system, because I was able to see how rampant those biases were while I was working in the system. And then ultimately, I came to understand that after really about 15 years of being involved in reforms with the system, task force after task force, that nothing ever changed, that nothing about the harm changed, nothing about the overrepresentation of Black children changed. It was just iteration of reform with no difference. So my entry point to the system comes on the side of being a person who's complicit in causing harm, and having that think about how I wanted to I wouldn't say I wouldn't call this accountability, because the people that I harmed are not involved and can't be involved. And in order to really have accountability, it needs to involve the people who've been harmed. And I can't do that. But I think it's my responsibility as a person who is complicit in causing harm to talk about the harm that I've caused and to work toward that harm on a broader scale ending.
So in reading your book, Alan, it really brought to mind for me, these ideas and notions of how we come to know what we know in the profession and the role that social construction of ideas occurs. And so I want to kind of frame the discussion around these ideas and notions of knowledge production and social constructionism. And I shared just two resources. One from Berger, he wrote a treatise on the sociology of knowledge, where, he talks about how knowledge is socially constructed, and that these social ideas and notions become a shared reality through institutions and practice and discourse and narratives, which was very evident for me in this book, how, narratives around whiteness, anti-Blackness kind of shaped this legacy that you're talking about. And then Michel Foucault talks about the power of social control, and that social control happens through these ideas and notions of knowledge and mindset, and that social control happens through the control of ideas, and that helps shape our reality socially. And that was also evident in your book. So if you can talk a little bit about how these ideas of social constructionism and knowledge production apply to the research and the writing of Confronting the Racist Legacy.
Mm-hmm. It really, I would say, informs the entire backdrop of the book in the sense that, and the modern child welfare system, because what we have come to know about today's child welfare system is all based on a system of white supremacy and then a culture of whiteness that results from white supremacy, where white middle-class parenting is viewed as the norm, is viewed as the standard by which all other people are judged against. And that idea about this white normative middle-class parenting standard, those ideas are built into the policies and practices that the child welfare system operates within. So it starts just on that kind of policy level about the system itself. But I think it's even bigger than that, in the sense that in the book I call this the white imagination, that all of us, regardless of our race or our ethnic background, exist in the white imagination because we've been socialized in a country that was built by white people for the explicit purpose of benefiting white people, where our laws and policies have been created over time to maintain white power, to keep white people at the top and everyone else underneath them. That has created for all of us the idea that we need systems of punishment, systems like policing, prisons, child welfare, immigration detention, to create order in society. And the idea that we can exist without systems that punish people, without systems that regulate people's behavior, is hard for us to conceptualize. The idea of white saviorism is at the root of the social work profession broadly, and also at the root of the child welfare system. And what happens because of this idea of white saviorism, which basically says that people, white elite people with money, can save children who are less fortunate than them, that emphasis on saving places the emphasis on individuals and rescuing them from their poverty, which creates the idea that their poverty is through their fault, through their own fault, or through something that they did. And it distracts us from the reality that poverty is a societal problem, or really poverty is a societal failure that the government has solutions for and intentionally chooses not to implement. We're focused on individuals, whereas the real problem is the broader society and how we choose to allocate our resources. But that's what a system of whiteness and white saviorism does. But we've all been socialized to believe that.
Thank you. There was a question in the chat that we missed. It says, first, I certainly don't want to assume anything about your heritage, but do you, as a white presenting male, encounter resistance from marginalized populations when presenting on this topic?
All right, that's a great question. I mean, first, I'm biracial. I identify as Mexican American, but I understand how white presenting works, particularly because of my last name, which is my father's last name and not my mother's last name, which is Perez. I think the way that I think about my place in this movement and why I wrote a book about the experiences and the harm that's caused to Black families by the system comes first from my professional background in the system in terms of having an understanding of the system. And secondly, the idea that I think it's important that when anyone is involved in any kind of social movement, I think it's important that that movement be always centered and focused on the people who are most harmed by that system. And in the child welfare system, that is Black children and families. Although I am Mexican American and Mexican Americans are harmed by the system, although I'm a gay man and LGBT youth are disproportionately harmed by the system, I would never write a book about the experiences of Mexican Americans or Latinos or LGBT youth in the system, because I think it's important that this work always maintain the focus of the people who are most harmed by the system. Because when we focus on the people who are most harmed by the system and work for their liberation, we're also helping the other people who are oppressed by the system. So I think the focus always needs to be on, when we're talking about the child welfare system, the need to abolish the system, the harm of the system, I think the focus always needs to be on with Black children and families at the center of that.
When entering the social work field, did you see yourself working in any other sectors of the field?
I didn't. Like I said, I changed my major to become a social worker and go work for Child Protective Services. I mean, I really, and this is I started working in the system in 1996 and I left the system in 2001. This was the system that I wanted to work in. And the only reason I left the system was because I had the opportunity to teach a course at my alma mater where I got my undergrad in child welfare practice. And I kind of fell in love with teaching and started to go that route. And like I said, I didn't understand how harmful the system is, as well as my complicity in that harm until I left the system. But I hadn't. This was the reason I got into social work.
Yeah. And then David asked, as a high school principal, I often wonder how it is that our students age out from foster settings are going to access college/career when they are products of a system that is failing them from the start.
I think if I'm understanding what you're asking there correctly, I think that's just testament to the harm that this system causes. When children are in foster care, they're literally experiencing trauma every day. System people will often focus on the trauma that children experienced before they intervened, without talking about the daily trauma that children are experiencing by being separated from their parents, their siblings, their communities, their schools, and really not knowing when or if they'll ever be able to return. That makes it very hard to focus on educational outcomes. Particularly, we also know that some children move foster placements and as a result move schools up to 20 to 30 times during the time that they're in foster care, which also severely interrupts any kind of educational progress. Again, system people will point to all of the resources that they're able to provide to help children go to college. Particularly, some states provide free tuition for youth who are in foster care. Some states allow children to remain in foster care until they're 21 so they could access some of those benefits. But the pushback that I think we should all have on those things is that no child should have to experience the pain and trauma of family separation in order to get a college education. All children should be able to go to college and be successful in their educational career without any kind of resource that the child welfare system is able to provide to them. So I think the logic of that is just flawed to begin with.
We're going to poll.
Hmm.
So, based on the book, there were several concepts that were socially constructed and contribute to the knowledge and understanding in the child welfare system. And so we're going to poll and see which topics you would like Alan to discuss. Child welfare and family policing is the highest request. So if you could talk about the concepts of the child welfare system and family policing to start.
So I'll answer that by talking about like why we use the term family policing. I think that it's important that we call things what they are. Word names like child welfare system, child protective services, foster care, those are all names given to us by the state, by the government, and they're designed to make us think something about the system that isn't the reality of the system. And that's part of what creates what I call in the book the myth of benevolence. The myth of benevolence is that this is a system that cares about children's welfare or that cares about protecting children, that places children in homes where they're cared for. None of that is the reality of this system. We already talked about rates of abuse and neglect in foster care. We've already talked about the fact that children are not protected when they're forcibly separated. In terms of thinking of children's welfare, we know that up to 70% of children who are currently in foster care, of children who are separated from their parents and placed in foster care, are taken from their parents because of what the state calls neglect, which is largely related to poverty. Taking children from their parents and putting them in the home of a stranger is not demonstrating a concern for children's welfare. When you think about how cases like that come about, think about cases where mothers who are living very precariously in poverty have to make a decision between going to work and leaving her child alone, or not going to work, staying home with her child, and then getting fired from her job because of being absent. And in many jobs, particularly low-wage, minimum wage jobs, you can get fired just by missing one shift. In many states are at-will states. They're not protected in the same way that some of us who have salary type jobs have. If we were really concerned about children's welfare as a society, if a mother has to make that really difficult choice, what would we do to care for that child? We as a society would provide that mother with daycare so that she has a place for her child to be while she goes to work. But that's not what we do. We take that child away and put that child in the home of a stranger. So when we look at these issues of poverty, what we see is that the system is taking children from their parents because of largely poverty-related concerns, and then placing them in the home of a stranger, and then giving that stranger money to take care of someone else's child when all that child's parents need is money. That doesn't make any sense. In Texas, we give foster parents an average of about $1,000 a month to take care of someone else's child. What if we just gave that child's parent the $1,000 a month? That would be a society that demonstrates a concern for children's welfare, but that's not what we do. So we call it a family policing system because when you really look at the roles and functions of the system, those roles and functions are largely surveillance, particularly in Black and Brown communities, regulation of behavior judged against this middle class normative standard, and then punishment when people don't fall in line, when they don't comply with services that are forced on parents, or some other aspect doesn't something doesn't happen that the system says needs to happen. Then those parents are punished by having their children taken from them. Those roles, surveillance, regulation, punishment, those are all things we associate more with the police. So that's why we call it a family policing system, because it's important that we call things what they are.
Can you, when you say surveillance, what do you mean by that? How does that show up within the child welfare system?
Surveillance shows up in a number of ways, but particularly it starts with mandatory reporting. Surveillance results from mandatory reporting laws, which are one, written incredibly vaguely on purpose, and two, come with penalties on purpose for failing to report something. How we see that play out is that children, parents are surveilled mostly in Black and Brown communities by professional reporters. And we see that happens disproportionately because we see that surveillance play out much more in schools, in neighborhoods that are populated by poor Black and Brown students. We see that surveillance play out in county hospitals or publicly funded hospitals versus private hospitals or in private doctors' offices. We see that play out in non-consensual drug testing of pregnant people that only happens in these county hospitals, not in private facilities. And then we see the disproportionate impact that happens in the reporting of mostly Black families. When I say surveillance, think about what we know from decades of research that happens in medical settings. Say two children, a Black and a white children, come to a hospital for similar injuries, say a broken bone, a skull fracture, and they're pre-verbal, meaning they can't explain what happens. We know from research that medical professionals are more likely to believe a white parent's explanation that the injury was caused by an accident. Whereas for Black parents, that child is going to be given a full skeletal to see if there's any other injuries, and they're going to be reported to a child abuse hotline. That's how surveillance manifests.
Can you also speak about surveillance within social work practice? What does that look like in terms of social work practice?
The entire profession is built around an idea of surveillance. Again, that results from mostly mandatory reporting laws. And social workers, as well as other mandatory reporting laws that really don't understand the harm that results from mandatory reporting. There are many social workers, many agencies who don't have the knowledge about what this system really does and think when they report people to this agency, they're going to be helped. When we know that they're not, when we know that if you report a child to a child abuse hotline because they're hungry, because they don't have a place to live, the system actually has no resources to help them. The system is not going to give them food. The system has no resources to provide them with housing. That's what I mean about how it doesn't provide any kind of help. But social work is built on surveillance because of their status as mandatory reporters.
Can you talk a little bit about these notions of help and morality?
Yeah, I think that idea of help and morality is important. And it also relates a lot to the barriers that we face in addressing some of the harms of the system. I could probably answer that best by going back to the example that I just gave about when I said what if we just gave the $1,000 a month that we're currently now giving to foster parents to moms who need that help. what would you imagine when I say that, when I've said that in other spaces, I'm often asked the question or posed with the question, we can't do that. We can't give that money to the mother because how do we know she wouldn't use it for drugs? That's the way that we've been socialized to think about poor mothers and particularly poor Black mothers. So our societies, and this is related to the whole idea of whiteness and where knowledge comes from and how knowledge is produced. But in society, we've been socialized to demonize Black mothers, poor Black mothers, since the era of slavery, but then particularly since the civil rights movement, and things like the Moynihan Report that blamed all of societal's failures on the problems of Black single mother led homes and called it a tangle of pathology. Then we have welfare queens, crack babies. All of those narratives influence the way that society thinks about Black mothers, as well as the broader, what people call the bootstrap narrative, that people can pull themselves out of their poverty if they just tried hard enough. So that's the morality problem that we have, that we're facing. As taxpayers, we're collectively okay with our tax dollars being used or being given to a stranger, to a foster parent, to take care of someone else's child. But we're not okay with the idea of giving $1,000 a month to a poor Black mom. That's the issue that we have to confront as a society before we're really going to make progress. Another really good example is the bigger picture. When we think about the bigger picture of poverty, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a report that came out analyzing some of the COVID relief measures that were taken. And we now know that in 2021, when the child tax credit was extended and expanded for 1 year due to COVID, child poverty dropped from 9.7% to 5.2%. So nearly in half, from about 10% to 5%. After that tax credit ended, in 2022, child poverty went up to 12.4%. So child poverty now is higher than it was pre-pandemic. But what we know from that experiment or that 1 year extension is that we literally know exactly how to solve poverty. And the government is choosing not to do that. People talk all the time about like this being this really difficult problem to address, or where's the money going to come from? It's we actually know the solutions. We know exactly how to cure child poverty. It is the government that chooses not to cure child poverty. That's the morality problem that we have in the United States.
Thank you. All right, so there's a couple questions here. Anonymous attendee, I agree, far too many children, especially Black and brown children, are removed from the home. In an abolitionist world, what would happen to children who really need to be removed? For example, a child who's being sexually abused and the family does not believe a family member is abusing them.
That kind of question is difficult to answer in the sense that if you remember what I talked about before, where abolition is presence, not absence, abolition is not just about ending the child welfare system and leaving nothing in its place. Abolition is about building a society where the need for a child welfare system is obsolete because people have the resources, the help, all of the things that they need to live safely and thrive in their homes and communities. That doesn't mean that harm will never occur. One, I think it's important to say that we do know from studies that have been done for decades that just providing a small amount of additional financial assistance to families significantly reduces contact with child welfare systems and significantly reduces actual harm, actual abuse, because a lot of harm is related to a lack of resources, a lack of money, a lack of ability to survive. Again, it doesn't mean that harm will not occur. I think so. The best way to think about that question, I think, is to think about your own family. Think about your own family, community, the broader network of people you love and care about, and imagine that a child in that family were harmed. What would you want to happen? Would you want to get together as a family and as a community and decide what needs to happen to protect that child from further harm? Or would you want the government to take that child away from you and to decide what needs to happen to keep that child protected from harm? I think most people, when given that choice, would choose the first option. And if you want that option for your family and you trust that your family and community could keep that child safe, then we need to get to the place in our society where we trust other families to do that for them. So if you want that for every family, then you should want that for your family, then you should want that for every family. And if you want that for every family, then that's what abolition looks like. So this is about not just shifting resources, it's about shifting power to families and communities.
Yeah. And that's to have that perspective means that you trust families with their decision and trust families in terms of keeping their children safe.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And you also trust that any resource that that family needs to keep that child safe is going to be available to them because we've built those resources up.
So how can we support stigmatized women and families who have their children wrongfully taken away from them? That is, when there are no instances of physical or emotional abuse.
Well, first, I would say that I don't know that the clarifier at the end of that needs to be present. It's harmful and stigmatizing to any family who has their child forcibly taken from them. I think the support needs to come from movements like this that work to end the harm of the system. The system itself is not going to be providing supports to mothers, families who have their children taken from them. The support needs to come from all of us watching, listening, to work towards first reducing the harm and ultimately ending the harm that comes through family separation.
In regards to abolition, what, if any, role do you see for volunteer-based programs that aim to build community wraparound support to vulnerable families or mutual aid societies to offer financial support?
Mutual aid programs, community-based mutual aid service-related programs are a huge role of the abolition movement. Those are the services that are going to take the place of the child welfare system once we abolish it. So absolutely, those are a huge role. It's just, again, keep in mind that the way those systems currently operate, even though they provide a lot of help for families, they still exist under the structure of mandatory reporting. So until we eliminate the structure of mandatory reporting, even these volunteer-based community programs still operate as mechanisms of surveillance. So we have to get rid of mandatory reporting as an immediate step and then work to build and strengthen these mutual aid programs.
What are your thoughts on safety, organized practice, and structured decision-making and potential frameworks and assessment tools that talk about mitigating bias among workers when it comes to decision-making in the child welfare system?
I would say that those are performative reforms that have been developed by the system as a means to distract us to think that they're really working on improving things. Things like structured decision-making, safety, organized practice. The problem with the child welfare system isn't that we need better training, better assessment tools, a more diverse workforce. The problem with the child welfare system is that the child welfare system was built from the very beginning to harm and oppress Black families, and it does that exceptionally well. No amount of training, new tools is going to change the harm that results from family separations.
What guidance would you give to a first semester social worker who is struggling with their role as a mandated reporter?
Yeah, that's a great question. Hey, Matt, thanks for being here tonight. I think mandatory reporting first is something that those of us in schools of social work need to do a better job educating and preparing our students for. There are many things that are currently called into these child abuse hotlines that don't need to be called. I really believe, and law is different in every state, but I really believe that, say, if you have a family who has a lack of food, a lack of housing, some kind of material need, and they're really struggling for that, the go-to of social workers, the go-to of social work agencies is to report that. If I think if you can refer that family to a service that is going to address that material need, there's no need to make a report. Most mandatory reporting laws say something to the effect of that people need to report a reasonable suspicion of imminent harm. If you're able to address whatever that potential harm is through really what Kathy just, this idea of supporting families, then you don't need to make a report. If you can refer that family to the food bank and then write in your case notes that a report wasn't necessary because you referred the family to the food bank, and then you followed up the next week to be sure that they had food, that's enough to cover yourself and to not make a report. And there are all kinds of resources, other things that we could refer families to. So here in the Q&A, Kathy asked about this idea of mandated supporting. And first, I want to credit Joyce McMillan with JMAC for Families for creating that idea of mandated supporting. But the idea of mandated supporting is that we can repeal mandatory reporting laws and replace them with this concept of mandated supporting, which means that when we see a family, a child in need, we have a responsibility as a mandated supporter or as a professional to do something to address that, to provide some type of help, resource, aid to that family. But we don't have the responsibility to report them to what we know is a harmful, abusive system.
So in reading the book, Brofenbrenner came to mind in terms of ecosystemic human development, which examines human development from a environmental contextual perspective. And I saw a litany of these examples in the book. And so just want to get your thoughts and your reactions to some of the ecosystemic challenges that contribute to the legacy of racism that you articulate within the book.
Yeah, I think I've probably kind of touched on this a little already, but it starts. We exist in a society that was built for the purpose of maintaining the power of white people. There is no like getting around that, and there's no escaping from it right now. So we exist in the society where the focus is on all of our laws, our policies have been written since the abolition of slavery for the purpose of maintaining white supremacy. So we have these huge systems at the larger federal government level, at the state level, in these agencies that are all built around laws and policies designed for the purpose of maintaining a system of white supremacy and a system of capitalism that this country is founded on. And I mean, really, those two things are hand in hand. The system of capitalism depends on white supremacy remaining because capitalism depends on the existence of an exploitable labor class for white people to use for capitalist accumulation. So we have this huge overarching system that is designed to keep white people at the top and other people at the bottom.
So when people speak of, disproportionality and the need for Black families to be involved in the child welfare system based on what they perceive as risk factors, but not considering the structure and the the context and environment and ecological factors that help create that risk, right? So you have people that are in the middle of these systems that create and contribute to their realities, right? And so when we speak about risk, because I hear people say, well, black families are involved in the system because they are more poor, or they are, abuse their kids more, or their kids don't go to school, right? Without taking into consideration that it's not a person issue, it's a systemic, like these systems that you articulate in the book very eloquently, from the laws to the policies and practices, have created structural barriers to family well-being and success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that comes from a lack of historical analysis and historical understanding. You know, after abolition of slavery, I don't think that we do a good enough job of teaching, talking about what happened in the immediate aftermath of slavery. We focus on the end of slavery, the emancipation of former enslaved people, but we don't spend enough time talking about everything that was done by white elites in society to essentially recreate a system of slavery that was now abolished. And that came through the form of black codes, which just created crimes when they were committed by black people. So it took things that were misdemeanors and made them felonies only if they were done by black people. It made it a felony to be homeless. It made things like vagrancy a felony. And the purpose of all of that was to create a system of mass incarceration of formerly enslaved black adults so that they could then be sold out or leased out through convict leasing programs and put into situations of forced labor, because of the loophole in the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery except in cases where a person has committed a crime. We don't talk about that enough. So slavery still exists in the United States through forced prison labor. And that's allowed to exist constitutionally. But then what we see is, so then we have those black codes that started the system of mass incarceration. Then we have Jim Crow laws. All of those things were legal until just 60 years ago. Racism, discrimination, oppression were deemed constitutional in the United States until 60 years ago. The accumulated effects of over 150 years of systematic legal oppression of black families has these enduring consequences that we see today, which are disproportionate rates of poverty, things like the income gap or the education gap. That happened because of things like redlining, implementation of the GI Bill, where only about 2% of Black veterans who were eligible for GI Bill benefits, actually received them. All of those things were designed to maintain Black people in poverty. So when people say that Black people or Black families are more likely to come to the attention of the system because of poverty, on the surface, that's true. Poverty is very closely related to involvement in the system, and Black families in the United States are more likely to live in poverty. But the reason Black families are more likely to live in poverty is because of hundreds of years of structural, institutional, and legal racism in this country. So every risk factor that someone can point to is the direct result of the history of and the legacy of racism in this country.
Thank you. So we're going to do another quick poll. to select a topic for Alan to discuss in these areas. Talk about this idea and notion of carceral logic.
Sure. Yeah, carceral logic is, I think I touched on it in the beginning related to how we think about poverty, but carceral logic is the idea that individuals are responsible for their poverty or their problems. That in like when we were just talking about risk factors, the idea that individuals create the risk factors that exist within, or families create the risk factors that exist within their homes. And then we have systems that are designed to correct those risk factors or address issues of poverty or whatever risk factors are resulting from poverty by providing the individual family with services. So when a family is identified as having risk factors, we send them to parenting classes. Like say the mom who needs daycare, we don't provide her with daycare, we send her to parenting classes. If a mom is housing insecure or struggling to be able to provide food for her children, we send that mom to nutrition classes or maybe a budgeting class to be sure that she knows how to manage her money, without recognizing that those are larger systematic societal problems. We blame the individual and we say that the only way to get help for that problem is if you go to these classes, is if you do something to correct or improve your behaviors or the way that you respond to this problem. And if you don't do it well enough, or if you don't go to these classes that we say you have to go to, then we're going to implement this escalating series of punishments up to removal of your children. So the focus is always on problematizing, pathologizing the individual, providing them with services to address the problems that they've created for themselves in order for them to be worthy to keep their children. That's what carceral logic is, because the reality is that none of those problems are the cause or within the ability of that mother or that family to solve. Poverty is a government problem that the government knows how to solve. But if we, society, keep our focus on these poor moms who need their children taken from them because they can't care for their children, we're not calling on the government to do more to address the poverty that these moms, these families are facing. That's carceral logic.
You talked about racism, but can you explain anti-Blackness?
Yeah, anti-Blackness is a form of racism. It's an anti-Black racism. And I think it's important to distinguish anti-Black racism from racism, particularly in the child welfare system, because most of the racism we see in the child welfare system is anti-Black racism. And we see that evidenced in the disproportionate rates of involvement of Black children and families. I think what we were just talking about with this idea of risk factors, if it was just risk and just poverty that led to children's overrepresentation in the system, then we would also see Latino children and families being overrepresented in the system because they are also more likely to experience poverty and many of the risk factors associated with that. But we don't. And the reason for that is because of anti-Black racism. It isn't just poverty. It's the way that we in society have come to think about poor Black mothers, the racialized narratives around poor Black mothers. When you think about those narratives, there are not the equivalent of those narratives of other people of color. When you think about the welfare queen, you immediately think about the Black mom. When you think about crack babies, you immediately think about Black babies. All of those narratives have been constructed specifically about Black people and create anti-Black racism, which is the form of racism that maintains the overrepresentation of Black children and families in the system.
Going back to the last topic, can you share anything you know about what kind of data is reviewed by the agency in terms of adverse outcomes from being forced family removals? And are there any metrics you believe would better guide accountability for agencies?
Well, first, I think it's important to point out I don't think that agencies are looking into these adverse outcomes at all. I don't think they care to know what the adverse outcomes are. Most of what we know about the adverse outcomes of forcible family separations and foster care comes from research that's done outside of agencies. And that research consistently shows that those adverse outcomes of foster care include things like homelessness, poverty, poor educational achievement, mental health disorders, substance use disorders, incarceration in the criminal punishment system. This is just there's just indisputable evidence that family separation causes significant harm and trauma to children, and then placement in foster care causes significant harm and trauma to children. So much so that there's no way for agencies to get around that. And that's part of the problem. That's part of the case for abolition that I tried to present in my book. This isn't unknown. This has been known to the system for decades, and they've shown that they're just fundamentally unwilling to do anything about it.
What steps can child welfare workers take that are currently working in the system to support the abolitionist movement?
That's such a hard question, because this really isn't about the problems in this system are not about individual workers. This is a systemic, agency-wide national problem. I know that there are many social workers working in the child welfare system who are likely very dedicated to the children who are on their caseloads and doing everything that they can to make things better for the children who are on their caseloads. Those individual caseworkers are never going to be able to change what's fundamentally wrong with this system. And that is that the system is predicated on the intervention of forcible family separation. That's what this agency does. So no individual worker working in the system is going to be able to change that. So that's what. So that part of the question is difficult. I ultimately think that particularly social workers need to look at our code of ethics, which says that social workers must take action against oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequities. And then we need to ask ourselves, are we doing work within a system that maintains oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequities, or are we doing work in a system that limits that? When we collectively ask ourselves about our role in the child welfare system, the answer to that question is obvious. We are working in a system that causes oppression, racism, discrimination, inequities. And I think we ultimately need to extract ourselves from that system because it's not ethical.
Okay, so as we shift into the what can we do portion and discussion, the model of change that Foster America embraces, it's the water of system change, and it outlines 6 conditions for systems change, and then the corresponding level of change, right? So, if we look at this, mental models is where most transformative change occurs, and it's pretty implicit. So that speaks to the narratives and the knowledge that we talked about earlier. In the middle are these the relationships and connections, the power dynamics, and those are relational change. That's kind of in the middle between that and the structural change, policies, practices, resource flows, right? And so, examining this framework for change, what are some ideas and strategies that you have to help transform the system or move the system forward?
Mhm. Yeah, I think this model is exactly right in the sense that we need to start with the structural issues, which are the policies and practices that the system is based on. And that involves repealing mandatory reporting laws as a first step. And then also addressing the removal of children related to because of poverty related concerns, because that addresses resource flows. Say if we just started with the 70% of children who are taken from their parents because of poverty related concerns. We know that the government spends about $33 billion to maintain children in foster care. What if we stopped removing those 70% of children and took 70% of that $33 billion and reallocated that to families and communities? That would fundamentally and structurally change our, our communities, the fabric of our society with that much money. And we can do that. That's a policy decision. I also mentioned, what we know about what the child tax credit did. We have done that in the past and we can do that again. We can pass things like universal basic income. We can pass things like child allowances. People always say things like, where is the money going to come from for things like that? But we've seen time and time again in our history and just our recent history that the government is able to find money when they need to find money. Think about the over $2 trillion that was provided to families after COVID as a form of what the government called relief. Where did that money come from? It wasn't allocated in the budget. Nobody knew that COVID was going to happen. So they had the foresight to set aside $2 trillion to address this issue. We had a crisis and the money became available. Those are the policy decisions that we need to make because it's not about where the money is going to come from. It's about policies that we create that direct where the money goes to that we have to change.
Thank you. Are there any strategies that you can suggest or recommend around the relational change area? So how do we shift power dynamics and how do we use relationships and connections to advance system transformation?
Yeah, I think some of that, if I think of some of the ways like money flows right now to communities, it's usually given to well-established organizations to implement programs to then inflict on people in the community rather than that money going to the grassroots community organizations that are led by, developed by parents and community members. So we could start by shifting some of those power dynamics by intentionally and purposely directing funds to impacted people who are in communities, not organizations and agency leaders to decide what's going to be done with that money.
All right, so here's the $1,000,000 question. How do we tackle the mental models, right? You wrote a whole book on confronting this racial legacy or racist legacy that has shaped and contributed to the experiences of Black families today. So, how do we disrupt that?
I think, I mean, that's a hard question. It's a hard question. But I think the hope comes in the reality that we've seen it happen before. During the era of chattel slavery, it was the horrors of family separations, the visceral understanding of how horrific and painful it would be to forcibly separate a child from that child's mother that moved white Northerners to understand that as a society, we cannot continue to do that. It wasn't the raping, the torture, the beating, everything else that was horrific about slavery that moved white Northerners to act. It was the understanding of the pain and terror of having your baby forcibly taken out of your arms. So we've seen these times in our history where the nation has been spurred to act. We saw that 5 years ago during zero tolerance. We saw protests around the country. We saw psychologists writing letters, sign-on letters, sending them to the government saying that they have to stop doing that. And the policy stopped. So we know that as a society, we have the capacity to understand how harmful family separations are and to demand that they end. We have to figure out how to recreate that because it's already happened.
I know it's tough. Especially given the times now. What do you think could motivate the political engagement and pressure needed to realize the kind of transformation that we need?
I think it starts by breaking through the myth of benevolence. And that is, I mean, in a large part, what the Up In movement does. And I hope that all of you who leave here will start to do with people within your influence. Most people in the general public don't know that 70% of children in foster care are there because of neglect related concerns. Most people think that the system is constantly saving children from severe harm, when that's not at all the reality of what's being done. Most people don't understand the harm that results from family separation, the harm that results from foster care. So it's educating people about the realities of that system that is eventually going to build the political will we need to bring about some of the policy changes we want to see.
All right, Alan, in closing, if you want to talk a little bit about the Upend convening that's coming up on October 17th.
Yeah, so if you're in Houston, but even if you're not there, this is a hybrid conference. So next Tuesday, the 17th, this is the 4th annual convening of the Up In movement. This is our first time doing it virtually, or the first time doing it hybrid. So there will be opportunities to be in person, but if you can't be in person, you could watch our sessions virtually. We'll also have most of them recorded and available on our website. But we're featuring the opening keynote is going to be between me and Josie Duffy Rice talking about my book. And then we're going to have several panels throughout the day talking about policy strategies, practice strategies, communication strategies. Many of the questions that you all asked about how to communicate. We're going to have panels with expert communicators, expert policy makers that talk about how to move the work forward. So go to upinmovement.org and you'll see all the information there. You can go to my website to learn more about where I'll be. And then I'll put in a plug for the Up In Movement podcast, which just started in September. If you're interested in learning more about family policing, we've designed the podcast to focus on each chapter of my book, starting with chattel slavery and the family separations done there. So if you really want to get a deep dive into the case for family policing abolition, you can follow our podcast as well.